a confession to make is that I had to go and take a look at what alterity meant and how it applied to architectural theory and practice. And I think when I was first invited to give the keynote, I thought, how on earth do I fit into this? And as you mentioned, that the call is quite sort of theoretically driven and so on. I think what's been great over the last couple of days is just the degree to which every single talk I've been able to attend has prompted a question that's really relevant to what I'm doing. So I hope that the talk is relevant in return, and that it sort of starts to investigate those interdisciplinary boundaries and boundaries between practice and theory that have been brought up. So thank you very much. I'm going to start off with a short film which was commissioned by the Grange Pavilion CIO. So they're the board who are now taking over the building. And I think they start off just by talking a bit about what the building is and what it means. And then I'm going to, in the talk, unpick the journey through the development of the building, talk about how research and teaching has embedded into that, and really sort of follow the track of questions that's coming up at each stage. So if I start off with this.
Being a Grange Town boy, born and bred, I think the thing that makes it so special and unique to me is the diversity in the area. There's so many different communities that all just seem to get along so well with one another.
Just a fascinating place with lots going on. We're here at the centre where all that's happening.
It's very multicultural, you see different people every day.
Grange Town is so steeped in history, being so close to the docks, and also at the same time a place that's dynamic and changing.
I grew up here and it's been a huge part of my life. It's very rich in culture, traditions, religion. It's a beautiful, colourful place. Dwi'n hoffi'r ffaith bod yna hen cymunedau, a mae yna hanes fan hyn, ond mae yna hefyd croeso cynnes I bobl newydd sy'n cyrraedd.
Just a loving, caring and welcoming community.
People in Grange Town aren't the type to sit on their laurels and wait for things to be done for them. I mean, look at this building. They're people who will just get up and give things a go, and they do it side by side and shoulder by shoulder.
The Grange Pavilion will benefit the Grange Town community because it'll be accessible to everyone.
It will benefit the community because it's like a space and a hub where people can go to ask questions, where people can go and hang out rather than just hang out on the street.
In terms of what it means to me, I think it means that actually I'll be able to see our little girl grow up and have something that she truly believes is belonging to her and her friends.
Grange Pavilion will be a place where we can invite all different people, ethnicities, and different backgrounds. It will be a safe haven for people to express themselves.
It's a real blank canvas, I think, for people to come together, create their own activities, or bring new activities into Grange Town.
Grange Pavilion is that space where young people and others in the community can get together, get to know each other better, and bring that togetherness feeling.
Dwi'n credu bod y pafiliwn yn cynrychioli'r gorau o beth sydd yn Grange Town. Mae fe jyst yn cymwysedd, dwi'n siŵr byddwn ni'n defnyddio.
The Grange Pavilion, as it is today, will be open to everybody, and we look forward to welcoming everybody to make use of our space.
And I'd say that within that video, each of those moments are really, really specific, and the people on the video are people that we've been involved with over the last 10 years. There's also people who aren't on that video because they've either passed away or they've moved or so on. So there's a real sort of sense of knowledge of the building from each of the people. And even the drone footage is from the Youth Forum, who managed to sort of get funding by saying that they needed the drone to be able to improve their football training. And so there's sort of layers and layers of input into that film. So I'm going to start off with a quote from one of the residents, which I started the abstract with. Underneath that simplicity, there is a complexity, but just getting that simple thing is important. It's a cafe with a space, with some growing space. And this is what a member of the Grange Town residents group noted of their aims for the redevelopment of the pavilion as they got started. The small group of residents meeting round kitchen tables had taken on this task of activating a civic space in a context of austerity cuts in Wales' most ethnically diverse ward, Grange Town. And for those of you who were here yesterday, you'll have heard quite a lot about the context of Grange Town. It sits in the southern arc of Cardiff, so it's an area that extends from Ely Cairo on the west through to Rumney in the east. And there's a 20-year lifespan difference when you cross over the boundary between the southern half and the northern half of Cardiff. So Grange Town is frequently defined through its reference to little ranking on multiple deprivation index statistics in terms of economy, environment, housing and health. So some really challenging contexts to work with. As an activist and a participator, educator and researcher, my research and teaching has intertwined closely with this since 2011, pursuing questions it's raised along the way. So some of those questions: what does a space for all mean? in an immediate context of austerity and gentrification? How might the design, construction, ownership, and the ongoing management of a civic space invite and welcome conviviality and conflict? How can a small building in a small park act as a catalyst for increased agency amongst fluid networks, never-changing networks of residents and public, private and third sector actors? And what agency do we offer as architect or architecture student in gathering partnerships through a physical space? Our long-term partnership with the Grange Pavilion, over 10 years and ongoing, has given a broad range of researchers, educators, students and resident partners the room to respond to questions as they emerge, taking us through changing and challenging contexts. So challenges posed by austerity, by racial and economic inequalities, power imbalances in accessing knowledge, resource scarcity, climate crisis, are collectively questioned and actioned, and they continuously bring us out of our comfort zones, challenging us by constantly placing us in a state of otherness, both in terms of relationships to our own disciplines, but also in terms of our relationships to each other, and whether as others external to a community, we even have the right to be present, to lead projects or to secure funding. So despite having worked in Grangetown for 10 years, I make no claim to know it. And I think the land upon which we stand in Grangetown has shifted so seismically, economically, socially and ecologically in the last 10 years that in some ways we can't ever claim to know it, and we start anew every year. Most recently, I've been directed to Adrian Mhairi Brown's strategy of inch wide, mile deep. Mhairi Brown writes, "We need each other. I love the idea of shifting from mile wide, inch deep movements to inch-wide, mile-deep movements that schism the existing paradigm." So Mhairi Brown urges that we move from wide and shallow working or task-oriented actions, ways of working that we so often experience as architects as we move from one place briefly to another, and instead commit ourselves to plunging deeply in and planting ourselves deeply and committing to embedded relationships and all of their complexities. So to explain this, I'd like to share our collective work at the Grange Pavilion through 3 moments or prompts, each of which stopped me in my tracks along the way and shifted my understanding of the consequences of our actions or bringing us into otherness. The fact that we've been able to track and reflect on and contextualise these moments has been supported by Cardiff University funding, a 2015 RIBA research grant with Neil Turnbull, and then most recently an AHRC grant. So first, it's not about the visions, but how they understand the us of us, or how we made a brief for an architect. Ourselves is a subject of discussion, residents wrote to each other, as they discussed how to go about doing something about a deteriorating vacant Bowes Pavilion in the heart of their neighbouring popular park. Understanding the us of a community, taking a deep dive into understanding the us, began with a widening out of understanding the context of what had spurred a group of residents into taking an action. The decision by this loosely gathered group to do something about this deteriorating building related to local authority austerity cuts, through which the local council had sought to devolve its asset portfolio by transferring assets or civic spaces now reframed economically as liabilities directly to community groups. The transfer of civic assets from government to community sat within a broader UK context of a shrinking state role in managing civic facilities and services. David Cameron's 2011 Big Society speech describing the agenda of giving local communities, quote, more power and control, quote, to come forward and help and run, more power and control to improve their communities, offered residents, as a sort of generous act, the opportunity to come and run their local facilities that the state couldn't afford to keep open. So framed by Cameron's speech as a generous act, Big Society had in fact launched, following a June 2010 austerity budget speech by then Chancellor George Osborne. And the altruistic aspirations of Big Society would play out as an economic necessity as deep austerity budgets hit local authorities. Not long after Cameron's speech, Cardiff Council launched their Stepping Up programme to support the transfer of civic assets and services to local community groups. Writing that austerity budgets demanded new and efficient ways of working, Cardiff Council called directly for communities to take a creative response in stepping up to take over civic assets. As a national call went out for communities to collectively redefine their role in the management of civic spaces, RIBA similarly highlighted a shifting role for architects in response to the 2011 Localism Act, suggesting that architects work with rather than for communities. And the publication the same year of Spatial Agency, Other Ways of Working by Awen, Schneider and Till declared an expansion of architectural praxis with reference to Henri Lefebvre's definition of social space as a social product. Spatial Agency proposed that the skills and ways of working that go into the production of buildings need not be abandoned, but could instead be deployed towards ends other than a fixed notion of architecture as building. And as we discussed yesterday, universities at the same time were also under pressure to reframe their role and to challenge the perception of the university as an ivory tower remote from communities, to create boundary-spanning civic leadership, and to reframe students as citizens rather than consumers. Watson defined the challenge to universities to be of and not just in the community, as we discussed yesterday, and to engage not simply in knowledge transfer, but to establish dialogues across the boundary between university and the community, which is open-ended, fluid, and experimental. For me as an architect, and I'd been a practicing architect in Chicago for about a decade and then London for a couple of years, and they sat along practices I'd been aware of, both through practice and then returning to the UK in an academic context, of long-term commitments addressing contexts of deep austerity and scarce resources. So, for example, Andrew Frere in Rural Studio, who I'd worked alongside Andrew at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he'd picked up the long-term commitment Samuel Mockbee had made in Hale County, Alabama, as part of Auburn University's program. So this is now a 30-year program which is committed to one small town, completing over 200 buildings through live teaching projects with students. And we were lucky enough to have Andrew visiting us in July, and he spoke about this sort of ethical approach that they've taken in terms of being really, really attentive to not taking risks on community, but to work very, very closely with understanding the implications of their actions and sticking around to work with the implications of their actions. Similarly, I'd been able to work very briefly with the Astor Gates in Chicago, and his arts practice in Chicago, which he terms as recirculation of art world capital, runs by hosting meals with neighbours and collaborators and guests, and using this to identify value in undervalued land, civic spaces and materials. So the images shown here are excerpts of buildings from West Side Chicago, which is usually undervalued. Again, it's an economically deprived area, and he relocates them in art galleries across the world. But he also reframes art practice as community building, so deploying storytelling to take practical action such as real estate development, and that's the Dorchester Housing Collective on the right-hand side. And then as I relocated back to the UK, I was also aware of Dina Petrescu's work in Calmes in northwest Paris, in which they access urban spaces and install physical infrastructure to create assets through what Petrescu termed commoning for urban resilience hubs. So a practice of architecture which included creating networks of stakeholders as well as physical spaces. So these ways of working were all in Isle Mind as I took part in the Cardiff Futures course run by the then Vice-Chancellor, Colin Reardon. Challenged with developing interdisciplinary programmes, we as a team of 8 academics across disciplines and across professional services developed a proposal that the university commit to one long-term partnership with one geographically defined community. And this really came out of years of teaching architectural studios in which every year we would work with a different location, investigate it, perhaps meet some people, come up with proposals, at the very best perhaps do an exhibition, and then move on to the next place. And we always seem to lack the resources to be able to take anything further. So we asked the university to support a risk, to embark on a long-term commitment to one place, and to give us time to listen before setting any aims and to co-produce the aims rather than predefining them. And as we saw yesterday, the very first conversation, a resident charged us with the idea of taking a commitment to a relationship and not an affair, and that's advice that we followed ever since. So supported by evidence of interest, need and willingness on both sides, we put a business case to the university. It's about £100,000 a year, and we funded a project manager, a partnership manager, student ambassadors, and pilot funding for seed projects. And the open call led to expressions of interest for partnership project ideas across varied scales and disciplines. And as we described yesterday as well, some of them started off as one-off events and things to just get us going. Others have been much longer in scale. So the Grange Pavilion was the first expression of interest, a call to reframe the now closed Bowles Pavilion as a central space for the whole community. The residents group submitting the idea made no claim to be the community, had no fixed brief for the building, didn't own the building, and weren't yet constituted as a charity. So our role from the School of Architecture wasn't yet that of designing a building, but of beginning to design a brief, first by helping to build a community around the idea of a civic space. And there was a recognition from the community that the idea of community was complex, and this was discussed yesterday, that we so often speak about community, but here there was communities packed within communities, so no homogenous idea of what community might be. So a really sort of multi-layered idea of how we would start to collect a group of people together. So the residents set out a brief to us, and again, this was through a loose set of emails, and part of my methodology, funded by RIBA, was actually just tracking every single communication, so every email, every note, and we've been able to use that as a sort of database of what happened at points in time, and I think having that collected as well has been really useful to be able to look at it 10 years later and understand what was going on, because quite often you're so embedded that you can't actually see what's going on. So the residents set out their brief, employing the twin strategies of social ownership and user programme to promote a process of bringing together and so alter an otherwise inert social situation into a collective and active one. So quite broad as a brief for an architect. We were working at that time with project manager Rosie Cripps and Neil Turnbull, who trained students and residents as appreciative inquiry researchers or asset-based researchers. So this is a way of working in which you begin by understanding what's already of value and asking questions which specifically seek to identify strengths and visions rather than just identifying problems. This has been a game changer for us in terms of students working in consultations, because instead of getting a room of people complaining about litter, you end up with people really sharing skills and resources and ideas and visions. So the work acknowledges the challenges that are there but doesn't dwell on them. We start from a positive point of view. Students were asked to apply their architectural skills at that point to collect, analyse, visualise and then communicate back the memories and stories. And that became a database for us in terms of identifying what it was that brought people together and how that could start to inform a brief. And that really took place over the next 3 years. So we had a series of briefs working with undergraduate and master's students, focusing on storytelling and focusing on story making. We focused on listening, on asking positive value questions, mapping existing and emerging networks, identifying the knowledge, skills and resources already in place to support the making of the civic space. And aligning our RIBA research to the teaching briefs, we held conversations about what the community members thought an architect was and what they should do before developing a brief and before applying for funding to bring in professional architects. So the architects, the residents voiced, could engender confidence to demand better, could raise the quality of the question, should stick around and create a relationship, and should use feedback from residents to genuinely inform their practice. Think carefully about how you portray our community, residents advised, warning us that the way in which we portrayed the community, either through words or through drawings, and even in speculative work, would have an impact on that community. So we learned an asset-based way of working, making no assumptions, focusing on strengths rather than what was missing, and drawing what was really there rather than an idealised version of what was there. And architectural skills were deployed to design annual events and festivals, to maintain momentum and spread the word, and to support the gathering of a community defined by the civic space. So our collective teaching and research, year upon year, began building what one resident defined as a growing catalogue of community knowledge. Research and teaching outputs acted as evidence for funding applications, supporting first one-day pop-ups, then a 1-year licence, then a 3-year licence, and then finally applications to lottery funders and Welsh Government for large-scale professional fees and for the redevelopment of the building. So 3 years after we began, student work evolved into developing design briefs by speculating and testing ideas for a pavilion. I would say that in the 10 years, this was the only moment in which students actually did design work for the pavilion. And this was quite intentional. This was an MArch1 programme in which students were taking a concept idea from initial concept stage through to a kind of planning application stage. And we used this to provoke the community because students were given complete free rein to be able to test any idea. We were able to hold an exhibition that was quite provocative, but we could also say, oh, that's just student ideas. But it gave us the insight into what was working and what didn't work. So a lot of the work was really specifically based around not overtaking the architectural brief and not replacing the professional architect, but working around the edges and adding value. So picking up the aspects that a community group couldn't afford to fund. So the addition, the gathering at the beginning, gathering of evidence, and then the testing of more ideas than an architectural team might be able to explore. So these speculations informed the final design brief for architects Dan Benham and IBI, who began collaborating with us in 2016 as we began applying for funding for a £2 million redevelopment of the pavilion based on the findings of our 3-year residency. I think also important to note that we never had an architect working professionally with us for free. So we didn't ask for pro bono work. We felt it was really important that we valued every hour that the architect put into play. So there was a split between the students' work and the professional team's work. So how did taking an othering role as architects, working with events and stories and mapping rather than specifically designing the building, how did that make a difference as we progressed from gathering a community to the next stage, to the pragmatics of funding a bid? So prompt 2 was reasonable value for money. Qualities of making. Grangetown is full of the haptic experience of the eye, beautifully made details everywhere. Resident and artist Richard Powell observed of this asset-based approach, which had found craft, beauty and care everywhere in terraced housing, in parks and civic spaces. From the very first conversations residents had held with their local councillors, quality had been at the heart of the project. If something was to be done with a vacant building, it should be focused on quality. Show us that quality exists here, the residents reminded us. This ambition of pursuing quality was placed under challenge by feedback received following an unsuccessful funding application. Acknowledging that the project would offer significant social impact, the feedback from the funder proposed that it would not demonstrate reasonable value for money. Specifically, it criticised the proposed build costs as being more per square metre than a luxury flat and suggested to us that the budget should be halved. So how is the value of this civic space for 20,000 residents under a 99-year lease to be otherwise defined, measured and evidenced? And we wrote back to the funder, thanking them and saying that we believed that a civic space should cost more than a luxury flat. So this began for us a second stage of othering at the building through a question of how to frame value. And that's actually the prompt that led me to set up the value unit, because I was just so mad at that point. It just sort of exposed this idea about what people felt the value of a public space was. So we began exploring that, and they're still exploring that through master's units. The residents group had raised the question of how to measure value back in 2016. As far as councils or funders are concerned, money and outcomes are partners. Everybody's looking for a return. How that return is calculated depends on who and how is doing the calculation. We as the community have the pleasure, well, perhaps one day. So this understanding that it would be difficult to explain what the value of this building might be. In The Value of Everything, economist Mariana Mazzucato proposes a reversal of prevailing assumptions regarding the definition and the measurement of value. We must reconsider, Mazzucato writes, the stories we are telling about who the value creators are, and what that says to us is how we define activities as economically productive and unproductive. And I think really crucially, and particularly for the context we're in now, Mazzucato questions the idea that public bodies or local authorities hold back value, and that creative value comes out of the private sector. She actually feels that local authorities and public bodies put in place the conditions for creativity to occur, and so support that basic foundation of creativity. So she's really looking at how do you support creativity through basic foundations of the state. This began for us through teaching and research again to pursue reframings of value, looking at government policy, theories of aesthetics, RIBA social value toolkits, university strategic aims. And everywhere we looked, we saw recommendations and requirements, particularly in the Welsh context, to reconsider value. Ensure you are talking about what matters, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act recommends. This world's first, a statutory requirement for public bodies to make decisions based on considerations of impact on future generations, reframes value as long-term benefit, as what matters. So Masters of Architecture student Isabella Open developed an architectural design toolkit using the Wellbeing of Future Generations principles, using a storyboard to align decision-making to the Act's wellbeing goals. So this was the kind of work we were doing with students as well. It was sort of going deeply into policy. So some of the discussions this morning about how do you get students excited about being creative with policy were aspects that we were trying to explore. As the design of the pavilion was underway, first and second year undergraduate students interviewed future building users to map out the proposed life, so to capture the imagined value which would take place in the building. So this is students working with the designs that IBI and Dan were developing and working with their Revit models, but then starting to interview people who are going to be using the building and mapping their lives in the building. And researcher Sarah Ackland, working with us, mapped 3 years of email communications, making visible the growth of a network of individuals and groups and the activities and events brought together by the pavilion. And I think what was also really important to us was to realise that it wasn't a sort of clear, start and a continuous growth. I think it's going back to the murmurations of starlings this morning. It's a very similar idea that it's just a really messy process, and there's moments at which it just drops right back down to zero as we all got completely overwhelmed by the bureaucracies and just the challenge and the burnouts and people leave and so on. So it's sort of following the messiness of a process as well. And as the project progressed into construction, so this is taking us quite quickly through this stage of the project, and we did have successful funding applications and points here. The pursuit of quality and care continued through student internships, which sat with the contractor over the summer documenting moments of care. So what we really wanted to do through our procurement documents, through the relationship we had with contractors, was to really emphasise just how much care had gone into this so far. So what had been given and how could they feed into that. And we wanted them to treat this building differently. We also had a resident artist working with us and inviting them over to her house for cups of tea. So it was just this sort of basic thing of trying to treat everybody as a sort of face-to-face human relationship and trying to get the best out of the contractors by really sort of working and documenting what they were doing. The reframing of value had continued post-occupancy, reframing the role of the architect as remaining involved beyond design and construction. The criteria the residents had set out at the beginning of creating a long-term relationship extended to expectations that the architect would stick around at the end, that you'd continue involvement in the long term. Here, as they say, so who's going to come back and correct the correction that needs to be made? And that's the moment that we're at the moment as we start to look at what's working, what isn't working, how can we adjust that? So since that point, I've been working with architect Dan Benham and collaborating on the value unit, using a valuing of the pavilion as the basis for architectural teaching. So we had a unit run a couple of years ago on post-occupancy evaluation as the pavilion first opened up. So students measured the tangible, tracking the numbers of people using the pavilion on a daily basis, and then converting these using the UK Social Value Toolkit into demonstrating the wider impact. So I think this was a question that had been asked yesterday about how we were able to demonstrate impacts. And as you say, these are student measurements. We're not sure completely how accurate they are, but it does give some insight into how we can measure the broader value. At the same time, we're also looking at capturing narratives of people using the pavilion. So this is constantly ongoing. We've got this sort of huge database of interviews and videos and comments and feedback surveys and so on. And also just capturing moments of being in the pavilion. So as we start to settle into it and experience its life, finding out how people are just enjoying being in the space. And we're also capturing constantly what other people say about the building. So this I think, really meant a lot to us. Now in a Minute Media, which is a media company set up from Grangetown, suggested that it's an inviting and safe place to grow, exhibit, meet, film and create. Part of the teaching or the reframing of our role as architects has been to encourage a slowing down, so the inch-wide, mile-deep approach Mhairi Brown speaks of, and to really, really pay attention, so to really value the time we spend, getting to know what the pavilion is becoming, and to value everything that people bring to it. So this drawing is the result of a workshop, and it goes back to the comment that residents had made at the beginning about really using every post-it note. So every word on a post-it note is captured and included in a set of drawings about the life of the pavilion. So a lot of it is about, if we ask people to come and participate in workshops or surveys, so we've got a responsibility to really show them that we're using that and be able to feed that back and to demonstrate it. So having gone from concept through construction to post-occupancy, where do we go next in reframing our role as architects and educators and partners? So I'd like to end with a final prompt: we want our city back. While the pavilion was under construction, the Grange Pavilion group were tagged in a post by residents protesting a proposed housing project. Critical questioning of the longer-term consequences of the pavilion sit within a broader context of gentrification. Fears of residents reacting to proposed developments in the area with an all too familiar protest. Developments are killing off our city, the local action group wrote. We want our city back. The privatisation of, as well as the transfer of civic space, has activated questioning over who controls and who profits from the devolved civic space. And fears of gentrification are obviously at our mind as the pavilion gets up and running. Will the consequences of our reactions in pursuing quality be to do no more than accelerate gentrification and create the conditions for developers to be able to extract value from around the building? Suzanne Hall noted in Designing Space in Austerity Britain that the devolution of public space had taken place as a decentralisation of power, so the power of residents to run these spaces, without a decentralisation of resources. And echoing David Cameron's call for big society, the Grange Pavilion had in fact emerged from hundreds of hours of volunteering. So there's a huge amount of value that's been brought up that could easily be taken out by developments around the area. So while the value of the pavilion is captured by stories and numbers, it's accompanied by a degree of anxiety and guilt. As Aitken and I'll note here, in a study of community asset transfers, have we done no more than legitimise the withdrawal of the state from civic services? Have we done no more than lay the groundwork for profit-led development, which will extract enhanced value from the surrounding community because of our actions? So the next stage of our partnership picks up these questions. A UK-wide AHRC-funded project led by Professor Flora Samuel, as Dimitra notes, ran as Community Consultation for Quality of Life and in Cardiff as Community Voices Cardiff. And the project focuses on community consultation in planning and development processes and the potential it holds for community involvement in lieu of consultation in decision-making on the future of our cities and neighbourhoods. Community Voices Cardiff worked with two resident activists in Grangetown and neighbouring Butetown. Maimouna Solman, who runs an online session called the Privilege Cafe, which she launched during lockdown as a series of discussions about white privilege, and her I think a sort of gathering of a community of 800 people through Zoom. So a really extraordinary set of events. And then Shorik Nekab, an architectural student and the leader of the Grange Pavilion Youth Forum. And Maimouna and Shorik working with us led the process of converting the Grange Pavilion into an urban room for a month, setting up events and activities to widen awareness of processes such as Cardiff's local development plan consultations. Just out of interest, how many of you here live in Cardiff? Okay, so how many of you are aware of the local development plan in Cardiff? And how many of you have responded to the consultation of the local development plan in Cardiff? Yes. Okay. So just for context, the local development plan is a 25-year vision for the city, where the city makes decisions about where development will occur, what kind of development will occur, what the priorities are, and so on. This is the moment at which we get to have a say in it, and very few people know about it. And the people who do respond tend to be white, middle class, 50s, professional. You know, so this project is really looking at how do we increase awareness, but also how do we increase participation in it. So to kick this off, a series of community consultations was held in the urban room, reframed by Maimouna and Shorik as a massage session, an Eid party, food Fridays, and screen printing. So their idea was, let's just make this interesting, gather people, and we'll do the consultation and awareness raising at the edge of that. As well as a physical map, the project has run an online digital map, asking people to pin locations that they value most in Cardiff. So working again on an appreciative inquiry basis, the consultation seeks to identify places that people already value in Cardiff and creating an online and ongoing database of the places people value most and their views on why that place is of value to them. So what we really hope is that the city's going to pick that up with us, and we're working quite closely with the planning department now. And the idea being that if we have enough on this map and it's ongoing, as you start looking at neighbourhoods for development, you can start using these as places that already have value and that people already use in various ways. In Creative Ecologies, Theorising the Practice of Architecture, Helene Frichot urges architects to pay attention, be respectful, and to understand what is of value on a site before we begin our work. So we're seeking here to use the same method of co-producing a brief at a city scale before taking action. And alongside that, asking students to slow down, to listen and to look really closely, use this online database. So again, this method of if we start collecting information, we've really got to show that we're looking at it, we've got to use it and suck out everything we can out of that information. So we asked students to get to know Grangetown by visiting every pin in Grangetown, documenting it and understanding what it was that people thought about it. And we then created a series of postcards which we distributed back out at an event. So we've shared this database with Cardiff Council, and one of our aims is that this will be an online database which the council or architects or developers could start to use. So as residents described in the early stages of the project, an ongoing database of community knowledge. I should mention as well that the website is run by Commonplace, so they've also worked with Welsh Government on active travel map consultation and so on. So we're currently working with them on some of their methods for AI analysis of the open text comments that are put in place. So we're hoping that will continue. So the visioning of Grangetown, which emerges out of that, is one in which community action, ownership, agency, equity and connectiveness emerge. This is a proactive, forward-looking response, which differs from the anger and fear that a responsive mode of planning consultation often evokes when people are asked to comment on plans already made, rather than sharing their values from the start. Maimouna and Shoruk's role in the project also brought a critical rethinking of all that we might take for granted in planning consultation. Shoruk brought a critical perspective to the words we use, asking that we step back and consider what they really mean, how their meaning changes when used in a tick box manner or when used tokenistically. In appreciative inquiry terms, words create worlds. Using words such as breaking barriers invokes a barrier. It creates a world in which a barrier is present. So this was the result of Shoruk emailing me late one night to saying, I'm completely fed up of hearing these words. Give me a long list of words that she had experienced through consultations as a consultee herself. And we got to the point where we almost couldn't use a word, every time we sort of started to use a language because we tripped so quickly into the language. And these are all words that I've used. They're words that I use in funding applications because we know what they mean. We know that the funders are looking for it. So it's just that sort of stepping back and questioning and thinking, when are we using these words meaningfully and when are we using them tokenistically or lazily? So I am not hard to reach, Maimouna Salman, challenged a phase often used in participation. Committing to long-term thinking and to equitable working, to inch wide, mile deep, has developed relationships between a growing network of residents, organisations and local authorities. To reach people, we've reached out. As Maimouna says, I'm here, just talk to me. Maimouna and I wrote a blog at a public event she chaired at the Senedd, sponsored by Assembly Member and Minister for Social Justice, Jane Hutt, which Maimouna is now taking on tour as a participatory cafe roadshow across Wales. And the key recommendations from this, going back to the discussion yesterday, were, are the people you're trying to consult really hard to reach, or are they choosing to step away? And this was a really key thing for us, that people were saying, we're not hard to reach at all, we just don't want to get involved because we know your consultation is tokenistic, we know it's a tick box exercise. Is the consultation intersectional? Is it aimed at a wide range of interests and needs? Does it assume diversity within diverse communities, or does it address a homogenous voice? And so a really clear message was, don't treat community as one entity. Don't assume we're a part of a community because of the way we look or because of our faith. How do you work intersectionally within those communities? A lot about gatekeeping, so who's been selected as the acceptable voice of the community, and how is the power and skill to lead consultation within a community being shared and developed? So where's the funding going? Who's getting that funding? And is the funding going directly into community? What does the consultation offer and what does it extract? There was quite a lot about people being fed up of 10 years of being asked to share traumatic experiences for our pleasure as researchers rather than something that would tangibly impact people's own lives. So does it extract value from the community in terms of divesting funding and devaluing lived experiences? What will be tangible outcomes of gifts of time and knowledge? And words really do matter. The buzzwords of consultation, the words we use to describe it, are well known, they're mistrusted, remembered, and they have lived consequences. And finally, keep it simple. Just recognise the value of investing time to speak to people and get to know them. So we're embedded in crisis, economic, climatic, health, and trust in each other. We have, as Fichot suggests, a desperate need for other stories. Elsewhere, she asks, what stories emerge when we respect the situated nature of the spaces, buildings, plans, and issues we study, and how do these stories make a difference? I think one of the things that we're really pleased of is that RSAW, the Royal Society of Architects in Wales, picked up the concept of value for their 2022 Spring Symposium and set out a question about how do we reframe value. So they set the symposium theme around the idea of gaining community trust and impacting personal values in architecture. And they've commissioned a short film from RSAW's point of view, which I won't play just now, it's about 6 minutes long, but it's an RSAW Revealing Wales film, which is run by a local councillor. So the othering, or the alterity of a civic space, brought about other stories, starting with acts of gathering in a vacant building. The making of the civic space, so a cafe with some space, with some growing space, is now in a process of testing the limits of tensions between contrasting and competing visions of what Grangetown will be. Who is valued, who values it, who brings value and who extracts value. The conviviality and conflict of a plural society, using Suzanne Hall's phrase, is present here in all its glorious messiness as we progress from the co-production of a civic space to hopefully the co-production of an idea of civic spaces at the scale of a city. Thank you very much.